Good morning, everyone. Everyone have a good day yesterday? Yeah. Well, the way I knew it was a good day yesterday is I woke up early this morning and I started reading through the tweets from yesterday, and I kept on thinking, oh, I wish I had seen that. Oh, I wish I had seen that. I wish I had seen that. And I did that over and over. So for me, that was an indication of that there's a lot of good things happening. And I love the things I saw, but I saw there are a lot of other great things going on as well. And it'll continue to through today as well. So it's great to have you here for the last day of the conference. And we'll be kicking off with another great keynote session, again, on the theme of many paths, many styles. We'll have a special panel presentation about creative computing for all. I want to start by introducing the facilitator and moderator of the panel, Karen Brennan. Actually, Karen came to the Media Lab in the fall of 2007, just a couple months after we had launched the Scratch software. And Scratch was already getting out to the world, and we were already starting to talk about organizing the first Scratch conference. And even though Karen was the newest member of the team, it quickly became apparent that she was the best person to organize the conference, both because of her great organizational skills, but also she was so perceptive of so many aspects of Scratch, from the coding to the community, from the kids to the teachers, from the technology to the pedagogy. So Karen took the lead on organizing the Scratch conference in 2008, and again in 2010 and in 2012. So a lot of the things you've been experiencing over the last few days are building on that framework that Karen helped establish with that first Scratch conference. And at that first Scratch conference, I remember one of the best sessions was early in the conference. We had a panel of some Scratchers from around the world, and everyone loved seeing the Scratchers, so it was great. And then at the end, a lot of people said, we have to have lots more Scratchers at the next conference. And we thought about that because, of course, we love seeing Scratchers. But Karen said, well, I'm not sure that's what the conference should be about. This conference is mostly about how we can support people in learning Scratch, but we need something else to really pull Scratchers together. And that led to the birth of Scratch Day. And came up with the idea of, as much as we love the online community, it's great to bring Scratchers together physically. And Karen not only came up with the idea, but made the first website, and put up the map where people started adding their own Scratch days. And every year there have been more and more. And it's been wonderful to see how Scratch Day has grown around the world. And if the conference and Scratch Day weren't enough, Karen, I think, was also frustrated that seeing who it was that was using Scratch. As it got out in the beginning and people were finding out about it through their parents, their relatives, it wasn't really reaching as broadly and diversely as we would like. And Karen saw the importance of getting into schools, and that's what led her to get started with Scratch Ed community and Scratch Ed teacher meetups that she started here, and has continued as she graduated from here, moved on to Harvard Graduate School of Education, where she's now a professor there, and has continued work on these sorts of ideas, putting out the Creative Computing Curriculum Guide. Many of you have used that and have participated in the Creative Computing Online Workshop, and should continue to build on those ideas. And with today's session on Creative Computing for All, we'll continue to build on those ideas and go even further. So with that, I'd like to welcome and hope everyone will join me in thanking Karen Brennan.
Thank you for that embarrassingly long, but embarrassingly kind introduction, Mitch. I actually want to start with two notes of thanks. One, a note of thanks to you, Mitch. This is, and I say this unrepentantly, this is my favorite community. The Scratch Conference is phenomenal. So it's an honor to have been invited to facilitate a keynote today. The second note of thanks, I want to say a special thank you to Saskia, to Abisola, to the Scratch team. I have special insight into how hard this is to do. So a huge thank you to you in making it possible and amazing. And I know that you will sleep very soundly tonight, so I hope you enjoy that as well. So let's dive right in. So the topic for today, the theme, is this big idea of for all. And so we're going to sort of press into this, lean into this today. And so I just want to sort of set it up in this cultural moment. So huge announcement here in the United States at the beginning of the year. Our President Barack Obama, yes, announces that CS should be something for all learners. This is amazing. And I know that we're behind. The United States is a little behind other countries. I know some of you are thinking, like, we did that before you did. So this is a really powerful idea, and I got really obsessed with the idea of computing for all. I mean, you can quibble over its computer science, its computational thinking. I think of Yasmin Kafai and computational participation. Whatever you want to call it, we could have a whole set of conversations around that. What we're going to really focus on today is this idea of for all. And why am I so obsessed with this idea of for all? Well, partly, I think it's really easy to say that when we're designing, whether we're designing tools or learning experiences, we say, like, this is for everyone. But what tends to happen, at least it's been in my experience, is that it ends up being bracketed in some ways. Some people are included, some people are excluded, and I wanted to sort of use this keynote not as an opportunity for lecture or just hearing us talk about it, but as a sort of a moment of collective reflection and thinking about, are we using that signifier for all? And when we're using it, what do we mean by it? And I wanted to share with you 3 people who have significantly advanced my own thinking about what I think about when I think about all. Meryl, Nick, and Rhianon. And I'm going to ask them to start us off by just introducing themselves a bit.
Sure. Hello, everyone at Scratch and out there on the internet. My name is Meryl Alper, and I'm an assistant professor in the Communication Studies Department at Northeastern University here in Boston on the other side of the river. The work that I do mainly centers on young people with disabilities and their use of technology in informal spaces. My background before I entered academia was as a creator, researcher, strategist in the children's media industry more broadly. So Sesame Workshop, Disney, Nickelodeon, and so that influences my sort of relationship between researching products that are out there, but also how that can inform development.
Great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nick Giacobbe, and I'm a second-generation special education teacher. My father was a music therapist, and my mother was a special education teacher before they both became special education professors, so I feel like I've grown up around this work. I'm entering my 11th year as a special education teacher in the Chicago Public Schools at Augustus H. Burley School in the Lakeview neighborhood, where I've worked with students in 1st through 6th grade. I'm the current Chicago Public Schools Technology Innovator of the Year, and I think that's due in part that I'm a huge proponent of constructionism, particularly for learners with disabilities. I first learned about constructionism through Karen while on sabbatical at the Harvard Grad School of Ed in 2014. And I also had the opportunity to intern here at LLK with Ricarose Roque, who is actually doing a session right after this. So if you haven't selected one, I'd highly recommend it. Little plug.
Mm-hmm. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rihanna Qataris. At present, I'm a digital learning specialist in the Boston Public Schools. And in my role, I support teachers with technology integration. But I also bring a personal and a deeply personal perspective of disability. I myself am hard of hearing. Today I'm using an interpreter and captioning. I also have a younger brother who has Down syndrome, and my mom has been a special ed teacher for over 30 years. So I feel like I understand it on multiple levels. It doesn't explicitly have to be about disability, but disability pervades our life. And so I'll be bringing that perspective to today's conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled that all 3 of you are here. So our first question is, what does for all mean to you? And I'm going to come back to the 3 of you because I wanted to sort of share an activity that Wilhelmina Perigine, who works with me at the Ed School, we tweeted this last week from the Scratch Ed team and just said, like, what does for all, if we think about computing for all, mean to you? And I thought we could make this a little participatory. And so let's do like 2 minutes of turn and talk. So with your neighbor, what does for all mean to you? This is a trick I learned at the Ed School, rather than try and I'll cue you when the 2 minutes are up by just putting my hand up, okay? So when you see my hand go up, we'll come back together. So 2 minutes just with your neighbor. What do you think about when you're thinking about for all? how that is so orderly every time. So I wanted to share some of the sort of major thematic clusters that emerged when we took a look at all of the tweets. We could have just filled an hour showing all of the tweets that people posted, so I encourage you to check it out. But some of the major themes that emerged when people thought about all, they were thinking about for all abilities, for all ages, for all disciplines, for all genders, for all interests, for all languages, for all races and ethnicities, for all socioeconomic statuses. And so with that as the backdrop, I then wanted to turn it over to our fabulous panelists. What are you thinking about when you're thinking about for all? And we'll start with Meryl.
Yeah, so when I took a look at that list, I saw more of the what. I saw some discrete categories. And the way I tend to think about this is a little bit more about processes, about the why. What's behind that concept of for all? And so I think about for all as having to do with something social, there's something political about it, and there's something cultural about it. So something social about it, and that inherently has to do with stratification. So it has to do with when you mix a couple of those different categories together, or you consider them separately, you're going to be creating in-groups and out-groups. And so in what ways those get preferred into different institutions. There's a political component to it in that who gets to set the terms of their own participation, who is involved in the conversations themselves and setting up panels on participation, who participates on the panels about participation. There's a political component to for all. And then a cultural component. And thinking about accessibility as something that isn't just technical, that isn't just about does it work or not work, but something cultural. And to just pull it back more specifically to something like Scratch as a platform, thinking about in what ways is cultural participation valued as something accessible on Scratch. You think about, there's the Flash platform. Flash in many ways has many accessibility issues. And what kinds of content is being created on something like that is accessible to all in the Scratch community. So for all, I think of it as having a sort of cultural, social, and political component.
So when I think about for all as a career special education teacher, I'm always a bit curious about what for all really means. Have my students been thought about in that process? And on Thursday, I was inspired by Mitch's keynote to go back and reread Years of My Childhood. And there was a quote from Seymour Papert in there that's, what you can learn and how you learn depends on the models available to you. And so that made me think a lot about a 5th grade student that I worked with last year. He had to do a science project, and what he decided to do, it was on the human body. He decided to make a Scratch game called Immune Man. And Immune Man was a white blood cell that was designed sort of like Pac-Man, and he had a maze that was the human body, and so Immune Man would chomp, chomp, chomp all the bacteria. And it was a great visual way to show what the white blood cells do. And I was really amazed by it, and he had the aptitude to do it on his own. But I thought about what are the models for him in his life. He has a lot of advantages. He has a parent who has a computer science background and works in computers. He goes regularly to coding camps. So for this particular example, this project was great, and it was hard fun for him. But when I look at my students who don't have those models, it wouldn't be hard fun. It would be really challenging for them. So my call to all of you is when thinking about computer science for all, it actually goes back to what Nicole said yesterday, talking about those overlapping opportunities. So if we do someday have Scratch in McDonald's for students to play with informally, I want us to think hard about developing those technologies so that they include for all as a component. Because for me, computer science for all is both formal and informal education.
For me, when I think about for all, I think about empathy and design. So there's a lot of conversations about what exactly does good design look like? And I like to ask people that question. So for me, in my own experience, thinking about planning for that variability, a huge part of my foundation is universal design for learning. And so I think a lot about, when we're thinking about designing learning experiences, when we're thinking about designing technologies, we have to think about who we're including in that process. People of all abilities, everything that was listed up on the screen. And we also have to think about empathy, because empathy is a huge component. There's a lot of talk about social emotional learning, and we cannot dismiss the value of empathy in design. And I really encourage you, anytime you think about planning, to consider how you can involve people with disabilities in the process, people who have atypical and variable personalities, because people with disabilities can be innovators. We need them to be a part of it. There are a ton of articles that are coming out online. There's one on Fast Company Design about Microsoft working with all these people with disabilities. They've been doing this for years. And there's also different pieces of code that are showing you what it's like for a dyslexic learner when they're navigating a website. And when we think about designing websites, just watch someone who's blind tell you how they navigate a website. So think about who's involved in this process, not afterwards, but from the beginning.
So that's sort of a 10,000-foot view of how you're thinking about for all. I asked our panelists to dig in a bit, like what does that look like on the day-to-day for you in your work, and wanted to illustrate it with some visuals. So we're gonna pass the baton down the line. So it starts with Meryl.
Sure. So I should take one step back before getting into the visuals in that. So some of the work that I've published takes a way broader view about youth and disabilities. So I published through the MacArthur Foundation a report that's freely available online, both in print through MIT Press, but also as a free PDF on digital youth with disabilities, and thinking about what do we know about outside of just school purely or rehabilitation settings, how are young people with disabilities hanging out, messing around, geeking out with technology? What do we know? And then I have a book coming out at the beginning of next year called Giving Voice, Mobile Communication, Disability, and Inequality, also through MIT Press, that takes a kind of sociological view of what's going on in family settings around disability and technology, and what are the other kinds of resources that people draw upon, because technology doesn't automatically fix all of society's ills, nor does it repair some idea of disability as meaning that something is broken in a person. Not at all. There's this, we need to sort of critically look at how do people make things meaningful in their lives in relation to disability, but also in relation to their class background, their ethnic background, their immigration background and whatnot. But another thing that I've been wonderful to take part in the interaction design and children community, which kind of overlaps in certain ways with the Scratch community. And a little bit back, two colleagues, JP Orkad, who's at University of Iowa, and Shuli Glutz, who's in Israel, we started thinking about the wonderful framework that Mitch and folks here at MIT had laid out in thinking about designing spaces like Scratch, computational creation tools, as having, everybody knows, low floors, wide walls, high ceilings, right. So, thank you, keep bringing me. So we had just run a workshop at the Interaction Design for Children conference and thinking about young people with disabilities, and thought about a little twist on it. If we thought really concretely about different research we'd been doing around young people on the autism spectrum, young people with visual impairments, young people with speech disorders, in what ways was that model great, but it could be better? And so we wrote an article that was in ACM Interactions that kind of laid out a kind of proposal for what these tools to think of might look like. And so to start off, one of those was thinking about not just low floors, but ones with ramps. And I mean that in both very concrete ways and metaphorical ways. So also you have to get into the building if you're running a Scratch workshop. That's a necessity. That's not a nice to have. That's a necessity. But also ramps as invitations. So what kind of invitations do different kinds of learners need to approach the floor in the first place? And I say invitations such as other people in STEM fields, other people with CS backgrounds who are leading workshops with disabilities themselves, as sort of mentors, as people to deliver explicit invitations to take part. So thinking about low floors in that capacity. Thinking about wide walls but with frames of interest. So wide walls has to do with, kids can explore lots of different kinds of interests in a space. Any kind of interest that they have, they can dip into. But not all learners enjoy that kind of variety. That kind of variety and too much choice can make people stressed out or raise anxiety or just not be what they're into. Young people, for example, on the autism spectrum might be really, really interested in one specific or one kind of range of interests. And it's not to say that specificity, that's narrow and that's negative, but that might be somebody's space of comfort. So being okay with it's not every sort of inch of the wall that needs to be covered by every child, but that sort of certain spaces that are carved out are okay too in any of these kinds of spaces. Thinking about then high ceilings, but with tall ladders to get there. So what are the kinds of scaffolds that learners need to work their way up in increasing complexity in any kind of project? And that, again, can be scaffolding that's baked into a system, whether that's other kinds, drawing on UDL, other kinds of captioning or other kinds of font choices even. What's the different kind of scaffolding that somebody might need to move through a platform, but also social scaffolding as well. And then the sort of one additional, so a fourth component then, is thinking about the corners. And thinking about what about learners, and I say in the corners there, who are perhaps twice exceptional. So gifted learners with disabilities. Thinking about what are the areas of achievement for them that we need to maybe think and reinforce a little more. What other extra kinds of supports or resources might be marshaled to support those learners who very often, there's lots of research on there about those students are at extra risk of being bored or extra risk of being kind of tuned out if there's not those kinds of opportunities there. So, so for me, it's kind of a more theoretical, visual representation of it. That's kind of how I think, but thinking about how to adapt these kinds of models for explicitly, not just in a loose way, but in an explicit way, how it fits with disability.
So this was a model that was published in 2012.
Yeah.
How would you extend it, reimagine it, remix it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think it's a thing that came out, and so I haven't had a lot of conversations with people about it. So I'm very interested in afterwards hearing from people about it, because for me, the pushing on the walls from the inside or the outside comes from conversations with people. So I think that there's a lot of new ways to take it that I definitely haven't considered yet.
What are your initial reactions, responses to it when you see this? Does this resonate with your work? How would you extend it?
I think it's lovely, and I love how it seems to really synergize with how I think as a designer for students with disabilities. So thinking about having high expectations, but scaffolding each individual student to what they need to feel successful and to grow, having those wide walls and making sure that students have a personal connection to their work and are extremely interested and invested in it. It's really fantastic.
I reinforce what he said. One of the things about spaces like this is that how much flexibility do we have to actually adapt a space that we're working with? And that is one of the challenges that we have. I'm not a classroom teacher at present, but in the classrooms and I go in and work in, there isn't as much flexibility and adaptation possible. But I would love to think about this in the context of our current conversation about redesigning what the schools look like in the future in Boston Public Schools and in other districts as well, because I think that's enormously important.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I'd love to have this annotated with specific instances of what it would look like in the classroom and how could we help teachers think about it both in formal learning environments and outside of school. That would be amazing. Okay, so maybe we'll transition to UDL, to Rhianon.
Sure.
So I was introduced to Rhianon by my next door neighbor at HGSC, David Rose, who's like the father of universal design for learning. He's like, you have to meet Rhianon. She's amazing. She's doing this work in the field. So that's how we were introduced.
Yeah, yes. So thank you, Karen. So actually what brought me to Boston 4 summers ago was UDL. I was an undergrad not an undergrad, a graduate student at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and I learned about universal design for learning the first time there. And it made so much sense to me. It wasn't something I knew about in theory, but in practice. And so I said, I'm going to CAST, that's where I have to do my internship, and I've been in Boston since. So I spent a good year and a half at CAST learning about UDL and how we can use that in both formal and informal learning spaces. So being that I work with teachers, what I try to do is design those online and blended learning experiences that demonstrate UDL principles. And the biggest thing, if you are new to universal design for learning, is that it's about learner variability. By planning from the beginning, we can design these flexible learning environments. We have to have goals that are set so that we can design the best space for our learners. And we're going to make mistakes. I know I've made mistakes, but that's how we learn. And another thing about UDL, like if you think about these 3 different principles, we have to think about how we're taking in information. Right now, we're taking things in visually and auditorily. Some people might need some movement, so we have to think about representing that information. And then we think about expressing. Like some people want to say something out loud, other people need to write it. Some people need more time to respond. And so this is really critical when we think about designing in any kind of environment. And then the most critical piece where empathy comes in really is the engagement, the why. Like, why should I care? How can I foster authentic learning experiences? So I'm always thinking about UDL in the work that I do every day. So I want to ask you, what can you do to plan for variability? I hope that by demonstrating some of the work that we've done so far, you can think about how you can do that in your own practice if you're not already doing so. So this past year, BPS participated in the Hour of Code, and it was a great event. We did it district-wide, and these are a few images from the Hour of Code. We have the top 2 pictures from students at the Horseman School for the Deaf in Alston, and then on the bottom right, is another student at the Horseman School for the Deaf, and the one on the bottom left is a student at the Gardner Pilot Academy. And all of these are students of color, students who may have multiple disabilities, and they were so engaged. My personal favorite picture is the one where the little kid at the top right, he just wants to jump into that computer. And I love it because, you know what, he's engaged. Something must be going right on that computer. But if it wasn't accessible, do you think he would still have the same response? So thinking about what that looks like in terms of your design. And I absolutely enjoyed participating in the Hour of Code because it was really transformational for teachers and students. They thought about code for the first time, and others thought about taking the extra step with code. And then finally, we are having a conversation in Massachusetts, and specifically in the Boston Public Schools, about the new Massachusetts Digital Literacy and Computer Science Standards. They were recently published in June. And these are going to be very critical for how we are talking about technology integration in our district. And these are the 4 strands. And I want to highlight a couple of them, if you can read this. Computing in society, digital tools and collaboration, computing systems, and computational thinking. Now, all of these are critical pieces to understanding online learning, understanding how we're thinking about computational thinking. And what I absolutely love, I have to say this, and it gets me excited anytime people even talk about this. It tells you that people don't talk about it enough, is that in computing in society, it specifically addresses accessibility. It addresses teaching learners about accessibility, how to build accessible websites, empathy is an important part in fostering equity. So I really encourage you to check out these standards. And if you're interested in exploring our work, we create a lot of videos and professional learning experiences for our teachers. And our channel is up there in YouTube. We have 2 separate channels. We talk about the standards there. There's a lot of teacher-created resources on there as well. And all of this is part of our conversation about CS for all and digital literacy more broadly.
That's beautiful. I loved in your second slide this call to think about, plan for variability. If I want to get started, how do I do that? What are my first steps? I also appreciated that you said, like, it's okay to make mistakes. It's better to try and fail than not to have tried at all. But like, where do I get started? And what type of supports are available for me?
I would get started by really looking at the UDL guidelines. Look at the UDL guidelines, find somebody you know who's passionate about UDL, someone who's passionate about working on the same issues that you want to work on, because they can tell you the things that they've done that worked for them and didn't work for them. And I think a big part of this is that you have to be vulnerable, and you have to also say, like, this is going to become a change in my mindset. Because it really is critical. Like, you really do have to plan from the beginning to consider all the different components.
How do the kids that the teachers you support get involved in supporting planning for variability?
How do the kids get involved? That's an excellent question. I want to have deeper conversations about that this year. Full transparency, last year was my first year in the Boston Public Schools, so I'm still learning as I go along. And every day is a learning day, but that's one of the things that I want to find out more about. One school that I was more involved with, Horseman, they do so much already around that. I think that one of the things about learner variability in UDL is an awareness of your own learning, of what you need to learn better, because they always talk about becoming a masterful learner, mastery of learning, because master teachers are master learners.
Yes. Yeah, that's beautiful. Nick?
Oh, okay. So for me to show you what it looks like in practice, I thought I would transfer you virtually to my classroom in Chicago for a few minutes. So as you can see, there are some very simple technologies on display in this room, like couches, incandescent lighting. I'm very intentional about my space so that it's very welcoming, more like a coffee shop than a traditional classroom. And we honor student curiosity and inquiry as part of our curriculum, and that's where this project came about. All of my students in 4th grade get to go for the first time to perform through our school's music program at Symphony Center downtown, which is where the Chicago Symphony Orchestra performs. And it's a great experience for them, and they had some wonderful questions like, where did instruments really come from? Who designed them in the first place? And I thought, oh, what a fabulous teachable moment. So what I did is I used Mitch's learning spiral as a framework for guiding my students through the process of making their own instruments with scratch, makey, and lots of cardboard and copper tape. So would you like to see what one of my students imagined her instrument to be? All right. No sound.
It's cheery sound.
All right.
We'll back it up, yeah. Okay.
Right.
Redo.
And I want to make a flute that makes cheery sounds, like whimsical music, and that's what I want to make.
And so what we did is we used Seesaw as a tool so that students at the end of each working period would record a brief reflection on what they did that day. And what's great about Seesaw is that it's a two-way street. So not only did I have students assigned into critique groups where they would give each other feedback on their design choices, they could also asynchronously give each other audio feedback in these messages. I blotted out the student names, but and in the interest of time, I'll just tell you what student B said. He gave her 2 great suggestions. The first was, as she was building a whimsical flute, he wanted her to have a Twizzler as like a reed or a mouthpiece. So she would put that in her mouth, connect it to the ground, and then she could play like a real flute. His other suggestion, because he's a 4th grader, was that she should cover it with lightning bolts, because lightning bolts make everything more awesome.
So what I did for Create is that I went to Scratch, and then we played some notes, and we messed around, and then we changed the beats and the notes to make it different, to make it a whimsical flute.
And what I love about this is that it actually harkens back to Thursday's keynote with Bubble 103. She used the same words, messed around, when describing her process in using Scratch. But this is what really blew me away.
Hello. For Create, I did sheet music for my flute, and Mr. G put down all the keys that I'm using for my makey. and I put them down in the order that I like them to. So A 2 times.
So here's a copy of her sheet music that she developed for her made-up instrument. And it's fascinating. She wanted me to put all the inputs of the makey up, and then she went to the computer and tapped them out because we hadn't finished the physical artifact yet. But it's amazing to me that she coded the instrument in Scratch, and then music itself is sort of like a form of code that follows a logical sequence. So it's sort of fascinating how those two come together. But here we are on the final day where she got to finally put it all together and play.
So for play, I played with my flute right here that has all the makeys. And so it's really cool. And I also practiced my sheet music that you saw earlier. And stuff that I would want to improve at it is add a little bit more sound.
And so what I love about this, and here's a picture of the finished project when we hung it up at the end, was that at this point in the process, she's no longer working for me. She's no longer trying to earn a grade. It's about her own passion for the work that she does. And I think that's the magic that's in constructionism, that and working with her peers, of course.
Oh my goodness, it's so beautiful.
I think we have a little time at the end, so if you want to come, I brought it with me so you can fiddle around with it yourself.
So I felt incredibly fortunate earlier this year to go visit your classroom in Chicago, and I really saw this like profound commitment to planning for variability that Rhianon was talking about. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what makes it possible for you to do that work in practice day to day in the classroom? And I'm also going to ask Meryl and Rhiannon to comment on what did you notice using sort of your set of lenses in your work? What did you see in this example that made this possible?
Well, for me, I think it's having a very secure and confident administration at my school that trusts the teachers. We have a long history of developing our own curriculum. And so we're given a lot of autonomy to do work with children that we're passionate about. And so that's what gives me the freedom to get to experiment with things like this. Just so that you know, this was a process. They went on the field trip on Monday. They finished these instruments on Friday, and they spent about 30 minutes each day. So total about 2 to 2.5 hours of total work in this project.
So what did you see? What did you see in the example that made this possible?
I'm really drawn to the sort of social scaffolding that was provided in Seesaw, and both the opportunity to visualize feedback in that way, to have an audio component of feedback as opposed to like a Google Doc on the side. You know, Google Doc doesn't let you necessarily record your feedback in a tidbit. You just type a little message. And so the platform choices and the options of being able to provide feedback in a way that is natural, for her giving her journaling in a short video format is more natural perhaps than writing a long form or typing in a Google Doc or something. So for me, the social component and then the tools that had certain affordances for the kinds of sociality that were most natural for these students.
Also, going back to your triplet that you presented at the very beginning about the social, cultural, and political, the politics of the school, and that you commented on the power of the administration, the entire environment just oozed support in every space. And how would that be possible without it?
I would agree with everything that Meryl said. I just think it's super exciting that they have this opportunity to be able to create in this way. I see this student as a leader. I want to see her at next year's Scratch conference.
Yeah.
Telling us how she did all that.
Yeah.
It's phenomenal.
Just to levy off that, that's the thinking about leaders in this space and sort of, young people with different abilities being able to then sort of take charge and speak on their own behalf and being able to give feedback to what would make their learning better, what would make their ideas for learning among their peers better. And sort of this same process of, she seemed incredibly capable of expressing those, what worked for her. And so being able to then be a leader in whatever, whatever her desires are. But I think that it's important to have those opportunities to build leadership skills as well as computational creation skills.
And something that I'd like to add, something else that made this possible now that I think about it, is going back to the classroom this year after a year at Hugsy. Something that I've taken with me from the Media Lab was from Rick Rose's work, a very fine look at student process and recording student process and then giving that tool to the students as a way of reflecting on their own process. So that's something I'm certainly much more driven in that way now.
What are you working on still? Like, what are the puzzles that you're still struggling with, mulling over, keeping you up at night, but hopefully not too much? Your big questions. I'm trying not to make direct eye contact with anyone so they can have a second to think about it.
That's a question for all three of us.
It is a question for all three of you. Your puzzles, what are your big puzzles? What are you going to work on over the next year, let's say?
So I think for me, part of it is connecting the family conversations, the classroom conversations, the administrative conversations, and the ways in which those can be so different. And to add another layer to this sort of clinical, the work I've been doing has focused for a little bit on young people with significant speech impairments who use technologies as a way to produce synthetic speech and to communicate, which sometimes overlaps with young people on the autism spectrum. And so doing more ethnographic work in homes among kids on the spectrum and thinking about what are the ways, both the challenges that they encounter and the successes that what they achieve, and how families can scaffold this and what resources families have to support that kind of learning. But not just what they on their own can do, but the ways in which there is both deliberate and not necessarily so deliberate discriminatory practices that happen in the education system in the US. It can be a real challenge to be able to hold on to one's educational rights, considering different kinds of violations that can happen pretty regularly, and the kind of advocacy that's very often required on behalf of families for their kids to get the kind of differentiated, individualized education plan, IEP, people are aware of that term, to get those things carried out into practice. So in my work, I discovered a lot of expectations and hopes, especially parents who'd maybe just come to this country looking for something better, and significant disappointment. And that's partly individual choices, but it's also lack of funding in some critical areas. So some funding that was put towards new iPads that could have really been spent on paying educators, teachers to come for like an hour and visit a family and understand what's happening there. So there's a lot of assumptions and a lot of biases that get baked into people's own childhoods and backgrounds, I found. But on the ground, again, think about empathy. But what money do we put behind empathy? Do we pay people and not ask them on their own, unpaid, to go do this kind of work? What are we really, on a sort of institutional level, on a policy level, funding actively in ways that really matter? And I think that how do we fund empathy? How do we, what are the ways that we do that is a question that's open, and I think that's what I think about.
Oh, that's great.
In thinking about next steps for me, I'm really thinking about partnerships for doing more work like this outside of the school day in informal settings. Because if you ask any teacher, the one thing that they're always short on is time. And so I'm very curious about ways that we can do this kind of work for learners of all ability levels. I often see programs listed as enrichment and for gifted students, but I don't see programs that actively seek out the variability of these kinds of learners. So that's my big push is to go hunting for those kinds of services.
That's awesome.
What keeps me awake at night is how I can help teach and actively act in designing a more inclusive world. I don't necessarily work with students every day, I've said this already, but I work with teachers, and I like to think everyone in this room is a lifelong learner. We're all learning, that's why we're here. So I would love to work more on designing professional learning opportunities that are inclusive of all learners. I mean, Scratchers of all ages, all abilities, right? So having these professional opportunities like ed camps and conferences like this, I mean, this conference has been awesome. I have accessibility here, but this is actually a rarity, unfortunately. So I want to see more opportunities for us to design those professional learning experiences for all of our teachers, because not everyone is comfortable with disclosure. I have a lifetime of advocacy. I have a mom and a grandma who are big, huge advocates, and that's made a difference. I mean, Meryl talked about the parents, the families. I mean, every single parent, in my experience, who has a child with a disability experiences some level of guilt. You know, like that's never going to go away. Even my mom feels that way. So, but you can get past the guilt by still, you know, acting upon it. Some people never do. But I think it's our job to like design those spaces so when people come in, they can have it ready. You know, it's already accessible for them because they may not even know they need it either. So that's my big thing that keeps me up every day.
Yeah, small matter. Yeah. And actually, sort of one of the core tenets of UDL that I love so much is sort of like what's good for one is good for all, that everyone can benefit from it. And so when you create these accessible spaces, you aren't just thinking about this one person. Everyone can benefit from it, which is so beautiful. So the last question I'm going to ask is purely selfish, but I hope everyone else benefits from it as well. Sort of advice. You've given me so much guidance and given me new ways of seeing the world and thinking about things. So what's an idea about for all that you hope people, asking for a friend, will take away from this session?
So I think if there's one word, and you can tweet this out, you can, you know, spread it far and wide, the word intersectionality. You can Google it, you can research it. It starts explicitly, it's a term that grew out of Black feminist spaces in thinking about in what ways, especially this is started off kind of in the legal space, but what are ways in talking about women's rights and legal rights very often excluded women of color, and an active reassertion of power imbalances and thinking about who gets to define the terms of participation. And so explicitly here, intersectionality, that no child with a disability, you know, is not only the same because of the same, you know, across diagnoses can be different, but also just thinking about the intersections of class, and so the resources, and just getting a diagnosis is itself a very tricky thing to get if you don't know where to go or who to ask. So intersectionality and thinking about, to basically, we say about for all, but without thinking about intersectionality, you inherently are privileging some. And so an active pushback on it's always a work in progress. For all is always a moving target, but we can better aim on the target by having a sort of intersectional component in mind where we're thinking about all of the different differences that individuals represent. So
the thing that I want to leave you with is a couple of statistics first. So right now, roughly 13% of students in schools receive special education services. So that's 6.5 million learners. That's one out of every 7 to 8 students. So as you go forward and work with students, look at the ratios of the kids that you're working with. Do those line up with the actual population? And I invite you to go and seek out special education students. And if you're having trouble doing so, Mimi said it best yesterday. She said, teachers are great wranglers. And so make a friend with a special education teacher and get them to funnel students to you. You won't regret it.
I think they both said it beautifully. I feel like most of what I've been saying today is what I want to leave you with. I want to leave you with the urgency of having to design right now. Don't be retrofitting things. Plan it from the start. And it will be hard, but be open about how it's hard and be willing to learn always.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our amazing panelists. we'll turn it over to Ms. Saskia.
Thank you. I also want to thank Rhiannon and Nick and Meryl and Karen, who's been a huge inspiration to me for a long time. So could we do another round of applause? Okay. So just like the other days, I'm going to quickly go over our schedule for today to get you guys ready and excited for the rest of the day. So right after this, we have Ignite Talks in this room again, which I'm super excited about, and then panels and workshops throughout the Media Lab. And I encourage you to check out your schedule on your mobile phone or on the TVs or on paper. That's that. Lunch is going to be a little bit different today. We're actually going to serve lunch out there, but then we invite you to come back to this room with your lunch to join us for our closing session, our closing wrap-up session, where you'll have an opportunity for Q&A with the Scratch team. Also, a few last reminders. We encourage you to continue connecting online with our hashtag. We'd love seeing your photos and your tweets. We used a lot of them in the slideshow yesterday, so keep them coming. And also just a reminder that we have a Facebook group that a lot of people have been using to connect with each other throughout the conference. So this is yours to use now and continuing after the conference as well. And we'll send out this link too, so you don't need to furiously write it down. Just to note that there is a lost and found, and we have a few items in there. So see us at the purple desk if you're missing anything, particularly sunglasses or a single sock. And if you're already thinking about post-lunch and your post-lunch plans, I welcome you to take your badge to the Museum of Science or the MIT Museum where you have free entry. Just remember to show your badge. And also on our conference website, under the Plan tab, there are a few suggestions for things to do around Cambridge, around Boston. There are other wonderful museums available, so check that out. Our hashtag again. And then a final thank you to our sponsors. So I encourage you to check out something that you haven't checked out before today and have an awesome time and enjoy your last day at Scratch at MIT. Thanks.